That was a lot of housekeeping, but I apologize to everyone online. We needed to get through this. Our first session, and I think we are a minute early, so I will spread the introduction so that those joining online are joining bang on 2 o'clock. Our first session is about defining responsible leadership in the decade to deliver. I think we can all agree that we can look at leadership around Victoria, around our own states, leadership around Australia, leadership around Asia Pacific and around the world. And we can see the countries, the states that are leading. We can see what leadership looks like. And so it's important to be able to define responsible leadership if we are to deliver on the SDGs over the coming years. And so I'm delighted to introduce Sanaka Samarasinha. Sanaka is the resident coordinator at the United Nations, who will be joining us virtually from Fiji to talk about defining responsible leadership in the decade to deliver. Delighted to welcome Sanaka.
Thank you very much, and much appreciated for this invitation to participate in this very important event. For 21 years, I lived my life on my beautiful island of Sri Lanka, never leaving its shores even for a day. Eventually, when I did, it wasn't a matter of choice or design, as it was out of fear and compulsion. I was a law student and a journalist covering the turmoil in my home country. And my country back then had transformed from an idyllic paradise to one that was devastated by civil war and terrorism, where thousands were being killed. It wasn't a hospitable place for students or journalists, or for that matter, anyone. And so, despite my deep desire to stay and record the human rights abuses being carried out by all sides to the conflict, my parents made plans for me to move to Melbourne to complete my law studies. But very shortly thereafter, the journalistic work that I was doing with my friend and colleague Richard was beginning to make too many people uncomfortable. And so I was quite unceremoniously dispatched to the US to, quote, sit it out for a few months until I could get to Australia and begin and re-engage in my studies. Not too long after I left, Richard was abducted by the police from his mother's house, tortured and executed. With the worry that a similar fate awaited other journalists, going back home wasn't an option for me for almost a decade, until the president of the country at the time himself was killed by a suicide bomb. And needless to say, I never made it to Melbourne. And here we are once again, because of a pandemic that most of the world didn't see coming. Another opportunity to make it to your great city didn't transpire. Some time ago, when I was working in Iran, people used to tell me, if you want to make God laugh, tell God your plans. Ladies and gentlemen, my life certainly didn't go according to any of the plans I had for myself. But I can say that I've had the rare privilege of living in more than 20 countries and working and traveling to more than 100, and being touched by the stories and lives of thousands of people, men, women, and children who survived Ebola in Africa, who survived tsunamis and cyclones in Asia and the Pacific, who survived wars in Europe, who survived violence and discrimination in the Americas. They have all shaped my life and changed my world. So I'm here today to bear testimony that change is not only possible, change is inevitable. In fact, change is happening, and it is happening now. We can either understand it, embrace it, and work together to influence our common destiny, or we can circle our wagons, look out for ourselves, and say this is work for someone else. And if we do that, I have no doubt we will be changed into oblivion. If nothing else, the last year should have made this abundantly clear, even to the most skeptical amongst us. Ladies and gentlemen, as leaders of the private sector, collectively, you account for 75% of the global GDP. You are transformative agents of change and indispensable in advancing the SDGs that we all signed up to in the pursuit of life and prosperity for people and planet. Your role in achieving what might at times seem as the impossible dream has never been more crucial. As we struggle through a pandemic that has brought the global economy to its knees, we also have the unprecedented opportunity to course correct. It is, in some ways, our siloed, myopic engagement with each other as the human race and the ever-increasing emphasis on instant gratification at all costs that brought this disaster upon us as a people. The same selfishness and lack of vision is also what has put our planet in peril and created what we now know as the climate emergency. But even as we recognize our follies in failing to stop the pandemic, we simply don't seem to learn and apply those lessons in dealing with the even more deadly catastrophe looming over us, that is climate change. Whilst economic recovery packages in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic were an opportunity to act on climate, G20 countries have so far spent 50% more of their stimulus on sectors linked to fossil fuels than on cleaner energy. This will lock us in for decades more into industries that have put us in this dire situation in the first place. We're basically borrowing from future generations to invest in fossil fuels. Ladies and gentlemen, history will judge not only how and when we emerged from the pandemic, but how we did so in a way that saved succeeding generations as well. The time is now. We have targets and a roadmap, all the sustainable goals and the 2030 agenda. It will take all of us to make it happen. While I have always said that every single SDG is as important as the other because they're all interconnected and interdependent, if there is one that underpins how we will achieve them all, it is SDG 17. 3 words, ladies and gentlemen: partnership, partnership, partnership. And so in the next few days, I hope we're able to unpack in some detail what public-private partnerships, and I don't mean in the narrow sense, for SDGs mean, with a particular focus on those who are most likely to be left behind on this journey that we're taking over the next 9 years. A recent UN report forecasted a K-shaped recovery from COVID-19, an alarming signal of deepening inequalities between and within countries, with poorer countries and more vulnerable groups marginalized in the post-pandemic recovery and transition period. 89 million people in the Asia-Pacific region will go back into extreme poverty, many of whom are women, children, the elderly, persons with disabilities, informal workers, and members of marginalized communities. We're also experiencing unprecedented technological change, which has great potential for accelerating the SDGs. But it also brings much unpredictability and may drive deeper digital inequalities if left unchecked. Over the next few minutes, permit me to focus on 2 areas that are not only close to my heart, but I believe are at the heart of the SDGs and cuts across many, if not all, the goals: inclusion and climate change. First, on climate change, the evidence is startling. We are racing towards the threshold of a catastrophe. Science indicates that the world's oceans are now heating at the same rate as if 5 Hiroshima atomic bombs were dropped into the water every second. The world is already 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was during its pre-industrial years, and current emission levels suggest that the planet will warm by an estimated 4 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Dangerous greenhouse gases are at levels not seen in 4 million years. All this is causing rising sea levels, scorching temperatures, devastating tropical cyclones, and epic wildfires, as you have experienced recently. Climate change is intensifying extreme weather events such as storms, cyclones, floods, droughts, and heat waves. In the last decade, there were 3 times more weather-related natural catastrophes, mostly floods and windstorms, in the world than in the 1960s. In 2019 alone, weather-related hazards triggered 24.9 million displacements in 140 countries. The UN has 193 member states. Climate-related disasters could double the number of people requiring humanitarian assistance to over 200 million each year by 2050. Living in the Pacific, every year I witness at least 3 to 4 extreme weather events and the devastation they unleash, including 2 Category 5 cyclones that impacted Fiji in less than 10 months, just last year. Some years ago, I was in Myanmar working there when another Category 5 cyclone killed 140,000 men, women, and children. Sadly, those who are most impacted by climate change now are those who had nothing or very little to do with causing it. Pacific Island countries are amongst the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and climate-related disasters. The World Risk Index ranks the Pacific Island countries among the top 20 most at-risk countries. Since 1950, tropical cyclones and earthquakes have caused over $3 billion in estimated damages and losses in these Pacific Island countries. In Fiji alone, by 2050, the country's annual losses due to the impact of climate change and extreme weather events could reach 6.5% of GDP, with more than 32,000 people out of a population of about 950,000 people pushed into hardship every year. If global emissions are not drastically reduced, thousands of low-lying atolls may become uninhabitable within decades. Global sea level has risen by about 20 centimeters since 1880. A mean sea level rise of between 25 to 58 centimeters is projected by 2050 along the coastlines of Pacific Island countries. In Kiribati, a country that I cover from here, 94% of households have been impacted by natural hazards over the preceding 10 years, with 81% of them indicating that they have been affected by sea level rise. So this is not academic, this is not just a statistic. Higher sea surface temperatures will result in bleaching of coral reefs and retreating of mangrove wetlands, which means less diversity of fish and other animals. Ladies and gentlemen, 4 out of the 5 lowest lying countries in the world are in your neighborhood: Kiribati, Tuvalu, Marshall Islands, and Tokelau. The other one is Maldives, where I used to work some years ago, and some of you would have visited. Some of these countries have an elevation of less than 2 meters and could become uninhabitable well within our lifetime if we stand by instead of standing up and taking a stance. So what does it mean for you as the private sector? The UN has called on every sector to flick the green switch. In light of these escalating threats and to adopt credible plans backed by intermediate goals for transitioning to net zero emissions by 2050. Energy is responsible for over 70% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. I urge you to reinforce your investments in greener and renewable energy, which can reduce poverty, help power innovation and industrialization, empower women and youth, and at the same time address food security and mitigate climate change. It is being done increasingly around the world, and I have no doubt many of you too have success stories to share. Topping the Forbes 100 most sustainable companies of 2020 is Denmark-based renewable energy provider Ørsted, which completely revamped their core business from being a highly coal-intensive utility to being almost a pure-play renewable power provider. Divesting in fossil fuels and investing in offshore wind power helped the organization reduce carbon emissions by 83%. Shell expects clean energy to make up half of the company's energy mix within the next decade. Second, engage in responsible production. Design greener products and services in a greener way. Invest in greener solutions such as improved agricultural practices, green transportation, ecotourism, and the greening of food supply chains. Integrate sustainability into your business practices and afterlife of your products. What type of waste or impact are your products creating? Is there a way to reduce this? Increasingly, companies are seeking more innovative methods of promoting eco-friendly environments by integrating green practices in their business functions. The Bank of America went green when it realized the need for promoting a sustainable environment. Within a period of 5 years, the bank was able to cut its paper requirements by 32%. Coca-Cola has made substantial strides in environmental goals, including water preservation, energy and climate protection, and sustainable packaging. Third, and especially for this region, invest in the blue economy. The world's oceans are a massive resource for sustainable development and a crucial buffer against climate change. We urge you to explore and invest in the potential of the blue economy, which promotes sustainable marine life, but also provides immense economic opportunities for the people of the Pacific. The Great Barrier Reef alone contributes 6.4 billion Australian dollars to the country's economy. But if emissions continue to rise unabated, we predict 94% of coral reefs globally will be eroding by 2050. And finally, climate finance. Pacific states are currently falling behind on the implementation of their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. In terms of costing, all 14 NDCs have components that are conditional to external resources, meaning that these commitments will not be implemented if these resources are not found. The private sector has a chance to support the NDC's implementation by investing in climate change finance. Let me now turn to inclusion. Some may think that this is only about SDG 10 on reducing inequality, but it permeates through the 2030 agenda, whether we are talking about SDGs on gender, education, or jobs. Through decent employment, you can make a difference in people's lives. The crisis underscores the urgent need to safeguard fundamental human rights at work and to extend these rights to groups of workers for whom protections in law and practice are lacking or inadequate. These include women, people with disabilities, youth, workers in the informal economy, and workers who are migrants subjected to discrimination and living in contexts of fragility, conflict, and recurrent natural disasters. Some are even trafficked. I urge you to address some key priorities for protecting and promoting fundamental principles and rights at work within the broader COVID-19 response and beyond. Advancing gender equality in response to the crisis, the current crisis, for example, could add $13 trillion to global gross domestic product by 2030. And yet, while women have been at the forefront of our fight against COVID-19, 70% of the world's healthcare workforce, for instance, are women, they continue to be the most economically vulnerable. Nearly 60% of women around the world work in the informal economy, earning less, saving less, and at greater risk of falling into poverty. Additionally, women are shouldering more unpaid care work than before the pandemic. 47 million women around the globe are likely to be pushed into living on less than $1.90 per day in 2021, indicating the imperative to recognize unpaid work. Moreover, the pandemic has also sparked a shadow epidemic of violence against women. I urge you to apply women empowerment principles to empower them in the workplace, marketplace, and community by establishing high-level corporate leadership for gender equality, ensuring women's full and productive employment, promoting women's and girls' education and professional development, and increasing women's participation in decision-making at all levels. Take action and raise awareness about the increased risk of domestic violence when working remotely, and provide information about services to your employees, especially so considering the current global pandemic. Reinforce policies and processes that prevent and address gender-based violence in the workplace, at home, in the workplace and at home, such as a zero-tolerance policy for all forms of gender-based violence. Support integration and reintegration of unpaid carers into the labor force. Offer flexible work arrangements with option of home-based work, and improve workplace hours to allow more time for self-care. identify, promote, and provide targeted support and finance to women-led businesses, including in your supply chains. Persons with disabilities are a highly marginalized group for whom our society is largely inaccessible. Persons with disabilities have been disproportionately affected by health, social, and economic impacts of COVID-19, like with every disaster. I urge you to expand your thinking about disability. Do not only think of people who use wheelchairs and installing ramps when you think about disability inclusion. The Global Economics of Disability study last year highlighted that over 70% of the disability market constitutes those with non-visible disabilities, such as cognitive disability, while 29% of persons with disabilities represent those with the more well-known and understood visible disabilities. What are the recommendations for the private sector? Tap into the disability market. With an estimated population of 1.85 billion persons with disabilities around the world, this is an emerging market larger than China. Tap into the disability talent pool. More than 1 million working-age people with disability are looking for work in Australia alone. And 88% of employed working-age people with disability in your country do not require additional support from their employer to work. We have no excuse. Look to build their potential, not to supply them with their needs. Ladies and gentlemen, leaving no one behind, the overarching call of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development means putting the rights of the most vulnerable at the center of the COVID-19 response. With the right policy choices and measures at this critical juncture, we have the opportunity to refocus on the root causes of human rights violations in the world of work and achieve lasting improvements in the lives and livelihoods of workers and their families. We can, in this way, build forward better for everyone. From here in the Pacific, I would like to reaffirm our commitment to the governments and people we serve that we will continue to spare no effort to work in partnership with all of you in all these areas as we strive together to fulfill the promise of nations united. In a spirit of celebration, remembering our rich 75-year collective past, but also in a spirit of reflection and humility, we invite you to engage in the conversation today and in the weeks, months, and years to follow. It is a unique opportunity for us to come together in a spirit of tolerance to reaffirm our faith in the dignity and worth of the human person, no matter what age, sex, ethnicity, degree of disability, national origin, religious persuasion, social, economic, or political standing. Let us seek and embrace diversity of all kinds, for it is only when we become more understanding of others and they of us that we evolve as a human race towards a world of lasting peace, respectful of human rights and sustainable development for all, building resilient nations and empowered lives. Everyone's voice is important. Everyone's dream must be celebrated. Everyone's fears must be addressed. Everyone's vulnerability must be recognized. Everyone's potential contribution must be accounted. Through a mutually respectful dialogue that inherently seeks to understand each other, we will no doubt create a better world for our children than we found ourselves. Thank you very much, and thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me today.
Thank you for those inspiring words, Sanaka. And I know I've said it to many of you before, but I'll say it again. Partnership is the new leadership. Now, the main part of this session is about taking what we've heard and really trying to define responsible leadership. At the end of the panel discussion, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And so during the session, please add your questions using Chime Live. You'll find the Ask Our Speakers a Question box, the blue box down at the bottom. And at the end, our team will also circulate the room here with microphones which they will hold for each questioner. Now, I'm delighted to welcome the facilitator, Kathryn Sforcina, Head of Global Strategy at IV.AI. Kathryn is also a non-executive director at Fambot, the author of Digitalizing Sustainability, to be launched in November this year, and a senior expert with the UNEP, UNFCCC, UNIGF, and UNDRR. Kathryn, you have until 3:30 to define responsible leadership.
Thank you, everyone. Hi, it's lovely to be here and to be face-to-face. It's such a fantastic privilege. You'll have to excuse me, I'm in my jacket. I'm not used to the Melbourne weather anymore. To join me today as well, I'd like to also welcome Louise Adams to the stage with me. She will be joining me face-to-face. She is the Group COO for Aurecon, as well as being voted last year's CEO of the Year from CEO Magazine. Please welcome Louise Adams to join me. And we're also joined by Sanaka from our previous keynote. Thank you so much, Sanaka Samarasinha, for your amazing keynote. I'm really excited about unpacking more of the how-tos as you join us now too. We are also waiting to hear from Dr. Musimbi. She is not dialed in just yet, so we might introduce our topic before we introduce Dr. Musimbi Kanyoro as well. As you know, we're here today to speak about defining leadership in the decade for delivering, and what we're all aware of more than we were 12 months ago is that we live in a world of exponentials. On one hand, we have this extraordinary exponential growth of technology, of opportunity, of a capitalist economy, and on the other hand, we have an exponential growth in the degradation of our planet, both not being able to survive at the same time. And the thing that we do have in the middle of this, in the midst of it all, is us. And that is the one thing that we do have complete control over. And when we talk about us, it's about defining what that means to us, but also what we're prepared to do as leaders to step forward and ensure that we're addressing the exponential growth in both directions so that we can continue on beyond 2030 and for generations to come. So when we're talking about 2030 and the agenda and delivering the SDGs, we know that it's going to require ambitious and authentic leadership. Businesses are going to need to have the courage to stand up, stand out, and even if it means standing on your own. Doing so can create greater trust in key stakeholders, drive sustainable business returns, and build resilient leadership teams. So to discuss the values required for business leaders in the decade to deliver, I wanted to open our first question for the panel and invite Musimbi when she joins us. I'm aware that we are on our time frame. And invite Louise and Sanaka to answer our first question, which was around how we go about defining leadership in the decade to deliver. What does that actually mean to you both personally, and whom does this actually apply to? Sanaka, would you like to take the floor initially?
Thank you very much. Well, let me try. I mean, for me personally, I think, perhaps I gave a hint of that in my keynote. I feel this world is interconnected, and really, not feel, I know this in my bones, and I think I live it. I've experienced it, and I think for us to abdicate our responsibilities to contributing, making a positive change, is unfathomable. It's just a travesty. I was lucky enough to work in South Africa at the time when President Nelson Mandela had just become president. It was an amazing time to be a young lawyer in a place that was where his lawyer, George Peters, was working. And I used to sit every once in a while with George and listen to him, or sometimes President Mandela would come by. And his famous quote, it's impossible until it's done. So when people think about global problems and we think, oh my God, it's impossible. And why do I have to deal with it? Well, we're all part of this world that we're living in. We all have something to contribute. It's really a question of identifying for ourselves what that is, and having the courage to acknowledge that, and then being accountable to yourself to make sure that you action upon it.
Louise, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think for me, I think leadership in this decade, it's a mixture of privilege, and I think, Sanaka, you talked a little bit about privilege in leadership, but also the obligation. The reason I think that leadership is privilege if you go back, leadership used to be about having a certain person like a CEO stand out in an organisation, or a politician leader stand there and say, thou shalt do X and thou shalt do Y. And I just think leadership's no longer like that. I think people have a choice. So you have to see leading in an organisation as a privilege. People come into that organisation and they connect to you as a leader based on what you say and what you stand for, and and the narrative you maybe have for the purpose of your organisation, and they have a choice to follow you. So I see the new form of leadership is more about how do you build followership, and what you do with that followership, rather than the old traditional view that I'm the leader and thou shalt do what I say. It just doesn't work anymore. I think the obligation piece speaks deeply to a lot of what Sanaka said in his keynote, which is that we have this real pivotal trajectory point in the world off the back of COVID, where we really collectively can make a huge difference. I think we've all sort of been woken up by the experience that COVID has put into the world, and you hear people, I don't know about you, but in my friendship networks, you hear people that are starting to really rethink what life means to them. They're rethinking what their job means, they're rethinking what their family means, what's important to them. And so we have this really nice natural point in the world where we can pause and say, well, what is important? And we've also seen, the world took a breath. I think that was Mandy made that comment earlier in her Welcome to Country. The world had a chance to take a breath. So we've seen what pausing and stopping some of the stuff that we absolutely took for granted and absolutely thought was a given on the planet, to rethink that. So I think we've got an obligation to stand up and to be bold and visionary about what we can do, both from a government perspective, but also in our private enterprises, in our own firms and the like.
Absolutely. And with that too comes the role of supporting bottom-up action to ensure that we're diffusing these principles, frameworks, solutions, etc., so that they can have the maximum impact that they possibly can. And I'm going to ask this question and then we'll welcome Musimbi as well. With respect to bottom-up action, where do you guys foresee that we can create more opportunities for agency to exist within our organisations and our communities so that we can see more people taking up the role of leadership?
So I think for my organisation, we work in the space of infrastructure. So we are infrastructure advisors and designers. So we're a people business. We're a consulting organisation. So really, the key asset that we have is our people and the innovation and the skills and the ideas and everything that they generate. So this idea of really creating a narrative for our organisation and having a clear purpose of the organisation, and we very much see that our role is to create. And I mean, in Australia, it's a really important purpose at the moment. We're about to plug all of this money into infrastructure. They're sort of announcing that probably as we speak, a hell of a lot of money into infrastructure. So we have this opportunity to ensure that that money is well spent, and and the role that infrastructure can play in creating better social outcomes for communities way into the future. So I think in that we talk a lot about our, the people in our organisation, particularly our emerging professionals. They have all of this discretionary effort. They have all of this passion and desire and will to want to change the world and have an impact on the world. So facilitating opportunities for them to come up with innovative ideas to bring different views to the table than maybe, the tried and tested views that sit in all organisations over time, for them to bring those ideas, for them to create that creative platform for innovation and for new ideas to come. I think really the role that I play is to sort of engage that and empower it and enable it, and make sure that we're not, again, going back 10 years in leadership, sitting there going, no, sit there, you'll have your day in the sun, just wait, letting them have it today.
Fantastic, excellent. And Sanaka, you're obviously working with a lot of different people from a lot of different nations over a long period of time. How have you seen bottom-up action create agency in communities that you've worked in?
Yeah, if I could just footnote what Louise just said. Somebody, and I don't really know who it was, but somebody not so famously said, the person who knows most about transport in Canada isn't the Minister of Transport, it's the person who takes the bus every day, right? or the train. And it's something that I quote quite often in my engagements with governments in the Pacific and before in other places. I think, leaders are only good in leading if they understand their people and whoever it is that they're leading and why they're leading. I think it requires a great deal of compassion, particularly compassion for those who have less or no voice at all, the most vulnerable. I think it requires a great deal of humility and willingness to learn and change. And that's very hard because in the old days, and perhaps still today, you might say, our kinds of organizations tend to recognize and encourage people to think that they know what's good for everybody else, and that's how they become leaders. And so admitting that you are wrong is very difficult. I remember some years ago trying to encourage my teams in another UN office to follow what Engineers Without Borders in Canada had started. They don't do annual reports anymore. They do failure reports. And it was near impossible to ask people to actually write a failure report. And remember what they said when they started their failure reports is the only failure that exists is the failure to learn from failure. So that's the second thing I think is, the openness to hearing, listening, and changing based on what you hear and learn, because you don't always know everything. And in fact, you know very little without the people around you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you there, and very, very excited to hear what our amazing third panelist might like to say about that topic as well. To introduce you to Dr. Musimbi Kanyoro, the chair of the UWC International, former president and CEO, Global Fund for Women. Thank you so much, Musimbi, for joining us as well today. You've heard a few of Louise and Sanaka's viewpoints on defining leadership in the decade to deliver and what that might mean for how we can promote bottom-up action through diffusing agency. I was just wondering if you had any comments that you might like to make to that as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you, dear colleagues who have spoken. I think leadership in today's time is different from leadership that was before, because one of the things that has happened which makes leadership different is that the ability that we can communicate more and differently really has removed naturally the hierarchy that used to be there when leaders would have certain things that are private and hierarchically information has to be given to people in small bits. So you would have lots of confidential matters. And sometimes people or leaders used the sharing or lack of sharing of information as a way of controlling power. And people at the bottom of the hierarchy would have very little information. And so they have to work with that little information to get their work done. This can't be done very much now because people get some information not directly from those people that they work with, sometimes from the systems themselves, and the systems are easy to share. So I think that's one of the challenges, and I think myself a good challenge to leadership to be much more open, because I don't think that everything in organization needs to be dished out, especially information in small bits. I think there's very little in companies or in running organizations that is supposed to be completely confidential. That's one. But the second thing that I want to say is that we have so much knowledge about what can work well. And we know that when people are empowered, when their human rights are respected, when they are given space to grow, when they are given opportunities, they produce more. So why not utilize this knowledge? I think leadership can be really improved today if we can take what we know and apply it. And the third and last point that I wanted to make is that we realize that the more diverse thoughts that come on the table, the more that people bring their own personal experiences, whether they are experiences that have been shaped by culture or by family or by even religious institutions, etc. Whatever that difference is, when it comes at the table in a good way, it can be useful to improving the workplace. And it can be useful to improving whether that workplace is a place of businesses, an industrial place, like I have worked many, many times with them, people working in industrial areas, in garment factories in most of Asia and some parts of Africa. And I saw what could happen if people were treated differently, but also led to bring their personal experiences to work. I'll stop there.
Really valid point too. And I guess you're raising some things that potentially we didn't realise that we needed to deeply consider before COVID. But now that we're faced with these different convergent crises, we have COVID, we have climate emergency, we have so many global challenges that need to be addressed and so fast. How has facing these challenges changed your approach to leadership style in comparison to where it might have been before? And Musimbi, would love you, if you wouldn't mind, because you were already talking about that, some of the challenges, if you could extrapolate on that, and then we might open the floor to both yourself, Louise, and Sanaka as well.
Yeah. Thank you again. As one who has been working for years, for three decades, I've been working in the area of leadership that empowers women, that brings women to the table in decision making, that gives women resources and abilities, resources in terms of knowledge, in terms of money, in terms of dignity, etc., to the table. What COVID has done is shown, or shall I say, maximized what we have always known existed, the gap between men and women in terms of employment and opportunities, the vulnerabilities that women often face even when they have received a job, because they have to balance between where they give their presence at the family, at the care tasks that they do, as well as and the jobs that they do in the office. And now with COVID, we get many different reports from different countries showing the flight of women from jobs, because sometimes voluntarily, sometimes they are in jobs where they are the first to be let out when COVID has made the businesses not be able to function. So then we get this other aspect that we've always talked about in the movements that support, or in organizations that support the empowerment of women, the gender-based violence. Gender-based violence comes in many different forms. And in some of the forms in which it comes when it is physical is when there is expressed anger, sometimes out of nothing. And the fact that so many women are now locked up in places with the people that have often been violent to them already, and some that are beginning the violence because of the restrictions that are on. We have so much reports, and so many reports from all over the world, with no country really that is completely exempted of gender-based violence. So that's another COVID. What COVID has done is simply be able to show the world that these things are not lies, they exist, and that it has exacerbated by increasing the numbers. And the third one that I want to talk about is now, as vaccines are there, we celebrate the vaccines coming. But in some places, we see what used to happen during the time when we had the first treatment in men and women in the receiving of HIV medication. And now we hear in some places on my own continent where there is bias towards vaccines, women are threatened more by being given false information about vaccines. And so if they don't go to get the vaccines and they are the caretakers, we might have really some bad impact of COVID on our continent, for example. I'm talking about Africa, which we don't yet, but we fear that we could get into bad places, especially if we don't take into account all these giving information in the right doses to the right people appropriately. Stop there.
Who wants to jump in next? It's very odd doing it with the hybrid panel. I'm staring at Sanaka and Louise. Louise, are you prepared to?
Yeah, look, I can jump in. In terms of the impact it's had for me on my leadership style, I think one of the things, one of my previous leaders, he used to say that the role of a leader is to take people where they ought to go, not necessarily where they want to go. And I still think that that's a fascinating concept, and I still buy into it. I mean, the opposite of that is populism, and we see the impact of that on the planet. But what I think COVID has done is made me step back and say, that's fine. It is my role to take people where they ought to go, not necessarily where they want to go. But it also, and I think, Sanaka, you touched on this, there's also a piece where I have to be humble enough to know that I might not always know where they ought to go. Like, I don't have all the answers in leadership. And therefore, the onus is on me to show some of that vulnerability. And I think COVID-19, what it took to lead a business through that, which was an incredibly, particularly here in Victoria, where we were sort of, and I mean, this is on an Australian scale. I recognise we still have been incredibly fortunate on a global scale. But if I look at our offices around Australia, we had reasonable freedoms except for in Victoria. So you had a whole lot of uncertainty, you've got a whole lot of stress, you've got a whole lot of fatigue building up, and the whole remote working solved, we did solve remote working. I don't think we solved flexibility, and we talked about this before. So a lot of stress. So as a leader, I think you had to find the balance between saying, I don't have all the answers, I don't know where we're going to end up, and I don't know what this might look like, but I do have a plan for the short term, and that plan might be a 3-month plan or a 6-month plan, and then where does that fit into the overall narrative of where we're going to go as an organisation? So I think being able to show the vulnerable side, and it also gave, I think, a connectedness, because everybody was sort of tapping into each other's lounge rooms. I do think there was a huge value. I still remember the first time that our global CEO did a town hall, which usually we used to do in person. We used to fly all over the country and go all over the world, go to all of our offices. So we suddenly had this magical ability just to have hundreds of people log in online. And he went to start talking for the first time on the first town hall that he was giving to our whole global business. And his dog started going mental, like completely mental in the background. And he had to sort of apologise and go on mute, and, one of our other leaders sort of picked up the mantle and said, look, I'll step in. And it was amazing how many people wrote and said, oh my God, it doesn't just happen to me, right? Like, if it can happen to him, it can happen to everybody. So I think we sort of saw this humanity in leadership, and I think that has created a better space for leaders to not be seen as somebody that sits way up in the ivory tower that has no connection with the core and the ground and what happens day in, day out, but somebody that is just as human, just as vulnerable. And then being able to create a clear narrative around, we may not have all the answers, but let's go at this together.
Would you like me to take a stab, Kathryn?
Absolutely.
I seem to footnote Louise all the time, so why don't I just continue that? I think that's an interesting dichotomy, Louise, and I think, for many of us, that's a real challenge. At what point do you say, hey, you know what, maybe I don't know it? Not always successfully, I grant you that, but one of the things that I do try to do, and perhaps I've done it before as well, before COVID, is to say, well, first of all, to try to understand why people might think differently to the way I think. So, for instance, we're dealing with it with a very real problem right now in the Pacific, where not everybody wants to take the vaccine. I'm sure that's the case in Australia too, as it is in other parts of the world. And so, sitting down and understanding why that's the case before, coming out and throwing the science in their face, actually gives me, a different way of understanding the problem. More broadly, I think, what we do, many of us as leaders, is to broker knowledge between people. And if you do it effectively enough and we start a conversation, I think that's the best we can do as leaders. Instead of telling people this is where you should go, we actually create a space for a conversation to bring in those different ideas, possibly because we are a little bit biased in favor of vaccines or we are a bit biased in terms of climate action, we might also, influence that conversation in the direction we want it to go. Coming back to your original question, Kathryn, for me personally, what has it meant? A little bit like Dr. Musimbi, I think it's a sort of a reiteration of some things that I already knew, but I know it more so, and it's more in my face, if you like. First of all, it's the value and power of collective action. I see it whether we're talking about dealing with vaccines or we're dealing with the economic consequences of COVID-19 or climate change. And that just came, that's a reality that's in our face, the value of collective action. And it is personally meant something much more since the pandemic. And secondly, perhaps even more important, is the conviction in the dignity and value of every person. There are things that we took for granted. My parents, for instance, are in Sri Lanka. They're in their mid-80s. I haven't seen them in more than a year. I don't know when I'm going to be able to see them. My job consists of traveling all over the world. I covered 10 countries out of Fiji. I was hardly ever at home before the pandemic. I am now spending a lot of time with my family, as I'm sure many of you have as well. And I think, we have too long taken these things for granted. People mean something to us. People make us who we are. And we focused on results matrices, we focused on things rather than people. And I think this pandemic makes it much more real. I mean, firstly, starting with my own family and people I know, but every individual human life matters. And that's why I suppose talking about vaccines, making sure that everybody who can get a vaccine gets a vaccine is one of those things I've put down as a priority for our work here in the Pacific.
Yeah, and you raise a really interesting point there, Sanaka, about what we've been focusing on and how value and meaning has been placed so long on operating economic systems that produce rewards for shareholders and the like. Are you able to speak into or tell us about a time where perhaps you've had to speak out against prioritising short-term financial gains or incentives or a moral issue, and how you knew it was the right thing for you to do to take that risk?
Boy, I think I do have to do it all the time in my job, and of course, because it's also my conviction. But let's take a look at just this region now. I mean, I worked in places like Belarus and Iran and Myanmar, and all of those places where it was challenging. I come from a country that was torn apart by conflict, and it was really important to stand up for what was right and not just for what people in power wanted to hear. But just taking the here and now, one of the things I see with the recovery plans of countries, especially countries that are engaged in tourism, is to simply go back to the same old high carbon industry that it used to be. This is an opportunity for us to change and think about, how do we use digitalization, for example? How do we make sure that the economic benefits from tourism actually are shared amongst people who are most vulnerable, right? How do we build up the social sector and not just focus on one industry? How do we diversify the economy, and so on? So there's so many things that we should be looking at, but unfortunately, and I can understand that, because these are countries that are heavily dependent on tourism. For example, Palau, 75% of its GDP is based on tourism. And so they need the tourists to come back. And if you talk to a government that's so heavily dependent on tourism, they'll say, yes, that's all very good, and we acknowledge it. And Palau has been very good generally in terms of green and ecotourism. But what we need is for the tourists to come back now, and then we'll think about the greening and the diversification later. That puts me in a position where I'm saying, well, if you do it now, the way you used to do it before, you're going to be stuck doing it for another 10 and 20 years. you'll be importing your food for the tourists rather than growing it yourself. So maybe you want to consider investing in a different way.
Yeah, really interesting point. And I imagine, Louise, you might have a few things that you could share about that coming from the private sector perspective as well.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're reasonably fortunate. We're not a listed company, so we are a self-owned management. We have roughly 5,500 employees, and 500 of the managers own the organisation. So we have a little bit of flexibility in looking a little bit more long-term than, say, what you might typically see in the quarterly, rat race of the listed world. I guess one example I would use here, which was one that's very deeply ingrained in my memory, when I first took over the role running our Australia and New Zealand business, we were starting to talk a lot internally about what we wanted to stand for. We were looking at signing up to the Global Compact, and we were starting an internal conversation at Aurecon around sustainability and the sort of services that we wanted to be known for, and the types of clients we wanted to work for. Now, we had for over 30 years worked for the Queensland government on one of their coal terminals, and that particular coal terminal, I'm going to try and be a bit nuanced. I don't want to reference players, but it might be a bit evident, but bear with me. This coal terminal had changed ownership, and it was owned by a particular company that were taking a bit of stick in Australia for their brand, and we were working with them. And what we found is, as we started this internal narrative about where we wanted to position our organisation, we had this overwhelming groundswell of people saying, well, if you're going to work for them and do that, how do you reconcile that with saying that and being about that? And it really made us sit back as a group executive and say, well, how brave are we, given that we were deriving a lot of revenue from this client, but it really was work that didn't line up with this. It was greenfields coal work, and something we needed to transition away from. So we decided that we would pull out of that relationship. We would stop that work, and we would take what we thought at the time was going to be a fairly considerable hit to our revenue in the short term, with a view that we wanted to really go loud and proud about what sort of work we wanted to do in that industry. And we also had a whole group of people who had for their whole careers worked, on that facility for those clients. And so we then also took this piece around, well, how do we support those people? How do we invest in those people in the short term as we help them pivot their skills and find relevance into the future, into other industries, or even within that industry on the pivot that industry needed to take? So we sort of ripped off that Band-Aid. It was fairly painful. There was a lot of people that said internally that were very happy and very proud of it. We took a bit of public sticking in the media, but we sort of expected that. And then we had these people who were completely destabilised by the decision because they were then like, well, where does my future lie? Where do my skills play? So we worked with them. What I found profoundly interesting, and what made us really sit back and go, no, this was the right decision, is probably a few weeks after we made that call and it all sort of went through, I got a sort of summonsed up to Queensland with another one of our clients, and I thought to myself, well, here we go. Now we're going to find out, right? We're either going to have this exodus where all these clients are going to say, well, if you're not in there, then you're out. And so I went in with one of our leaders up in Queensland to talk to this client, and they said, look, we've been talking to your team. We hear the narrative about pivoting these skills, and we really need your help. We are challenged by exactly the same thing. We need to find out what our future's about. We want to pivot away from this, and we want to work together with you on it. So that was what proved to us that it was the right decision to make, and it was some short-term pain, but certainly now we know that as an organisation we can stand up and make the statements that we make without it being greenwashing, without it being false to us, and more importantly, we have people that are very proud, and a whole stack load of people who thought they could never change what they were doing, who have changed their skills and now adding value in a different way.
That's a really incredible example, and probably a very good reason as to why you were awarded the 2020 CEO Magazine of the Year CEO of the Year award. It was in recognition for your courage and capacity to implement effective strategies that enabled Aurecon to achieve their sustainable growth, wasn't it? So in that respect, though, I guess, can you speak more into your an example now from a more personal perspective of what is actually inspiring you to make these changes? I mean, these are pretty courageous steps forward that could go one way or the other on the knife edge. And if you wouldn't mind also sharing a little bit about perhaps what kind of support system or structures and tools and resources there are made available to you through Aurecon, so we can perhaps get some internal perspective on what enables opportunities like that to exist within such large organisations as well.
Yeah, look, I think it's a multi-layered question, so I'll try and do my best to give a little bit of an answer. I think, like I say, being a management-owned business, our philosophy really for ownership is that you know, that at some point in your career as an organisation, we will, you know, come and say, look, we'd like you to join the ownership ranks. But the view of the ownership around our organisation is that you are custodians of the company for the period that you're owners, and what you are doing is trying to build a sustainable business that you can hand on to the next generation of owners in a better shape than which you sort of inherited it. And that's very much a philosophical piece in our narrative as an organisation that makes us always looking partially to the long-term sustainability of the organisation rather than just the short-term goals of it. And we try and drive that narrative and empower those owners, therefore, in the day-to-day leadership. Because I think the other thing about leadership that you have to be able to engage is the fact that traditionally, I think people looked at a CEO and said, right, the CEO is the leader of the organisation. But when you think about leadership and impactful leadership, if I was to go and talk to one of our emerging professionals and say, who's the most impactful leader, they're likely to say, well, it's my team leader, it's the project leader, it's my line manager, because it's that day-to-day, that what I call everyday leadership that has the most impact on our people. So making sure that we empower people through the organisation to drive that narrative and to really position the organisation in the day in, day out. And if you don't have a strong culture, we spend a lot of time working on our culture, a lot of investment into building a culture where that lines up with our purpose so that our people are empowered. If we can, I think where you have a very strong organisational purpose and your culture is deeply intertwined with that purpose, then you can sort of take you can sort of free the reins up a bit, knowing that if the day-to-day decisions that are made at every layer through your organisation line up through that culture to the purpose, then you don't have to put so many controls and systems and processes in there to make sure everything's going okay. That certainly worked well for us through COVID. I think when everybody sort of ended up in their homes on the other end of Zoom, and we all threw a hell of a lot of money into tech companies to solve things like that for us. That culture that we had certainly helped us, and also the fact that it was a very caring culture. Because of the industry we're in, we spend a lot of time talking about safety, and safety and well-being is an increasingly important piece. So being able to just rely on our teams to look after each other was also really important for us. That comes into the choices that we make around which clients we work for and the sort of work that we do. We've got a reasonably clear narrative. It's not perfect. We continue to work on it because we continue to be challenged day in, day out on some of the legacy stuff that we work on. But making sure we have a clear narrative that says this is what we want to be part of, this is what we don't want to be part of. But we do, one of the things that we take very seriously, like I said earlier, being in the world in infrastructure, is the role that infrastructure can play in creating better social outcomes, but helping our clients go on those journeys as well. We don't want to sit there and say, well, this client's not signed up to the UN Global Compact, therefore we're going to walk away from them. We'd rather work with them to make them, understand the value of something like that and where they can pivot their organisation and how they can get better as well, rather than just walking away and putting their hands up. So I think I've maybe answered 10% of your question, but I'll probably let my peers have a go as well.
And Dr. Musimbi and Sanaka, did you have anything that you wanted to share in response to what Louise has shared there?
Sanaka, do you want to go first or do you want me to go?
Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I really liked what Louise said about leadership being experienced in various parts of the company. And perhaps what the businesses could realize that this is part of what has been happening in social movements. where when the idea was not so much to be hierarchical, but where in social movements you've had a lot of both volunteer leadership as well as employed leadership, and they have always experienced that kind of shared leadership, collaborative leadership, and there are so many words that exist for it now. And I think for me, it does help for us as human beings to build on what Sanaka said, that we begin to see each other more as people rather than as products and end products that have to show impact only by statistics. But I wanted to bring in also what I see as really powerful coming in through the UN Global Compact together with gender equality, where I work as an advisor. And what we really aim at is to support companies who are ready to drive business in action by understanding the importance of the gender equality through supporting the Sustainable Development Goal number 5. Currently, I'm really excited when I see that more than 40,000 CEOs have already committed to the principles, the women's empowerment principles that many of you who are within the Global Compact will know about. And the essence of committing to these principles is to have some guidelines that help us to apply and take action on small and big things that will make gender equality a reality. And there are only 10 principles. These 10 principles have been developed both by the UN Women and other sources. And now the UN Global Compact is really supporting companies that are able to take that and move forward with them. Another area that I saw that is really important is that through this working together and through the work that we do with companies that have signed on, the ability to cross-learn from peers and to network and to showcase the things that work for different companies so that other companies can be able either to try them out, to see if their setting is able to set them up, etc. This peer learning is beginning to be really important. A few weeks ago, in the last 6 months, there have been many regional meetings organized by the UN Global Compact, where people many different companies have talked about what works for them. And sometimes people have looked at businesses from the developing world and thought that these are going to be the most conservative in terms of gender issues. But I think that what I see different is that in the countries of the South, there is a very large knowledge of protocols of the United Nations. So they are more aware, for example, of Sustainable Development Goals and use them. And sometimes some governments even use them for budgeting. So when a company or people within the company, because it's people who make things happen, actually hear of we are going to join other businesses, other companies to promote something that is within the Sustainable Development Goals, it's not so strange to them as in the bigger companies that are in the developed countries. I have spent nearly 30 years working stationed in Europe and America. And I can tell you that there is a big difference in terms of those people that are able to use protocols that have been developed by at the global level at the United Nations. So I'm seeing companies from the South really getting on the bandwagon much, much faster in terms of thinking what could they do well in gender on matters of bringing human rights on the table, as well as having women on boards, women in leadership position, promoting senior staff to places that were often left out for women. And I hope that as many people join this, we will begin to see amazing differences happen in companies. And I think that the leadership of women, like Louise said in her own company, currently you will see all over the world people are looking at how women leaders of governments have responded differently in regards to supporting their countries to respond to COVID. And we would like to see more of this as well as with women leaders of company in terms of supporting companies to embrace gender equality. Thank you, Sanaka.
Thank you very much, Louise and Dr. Musimbi. Perhaps if I just add a little personal touch to this. I remember back in the day when I was working in the private sector in the US and coming out of law school, I'd always wanted to be a lawyer. And I remember when I was a young child, I used to be the boy down the lane who used to always win any board game that I played, whether it was Monopoly or Scrabble or whatever else it was, because I was the only kid who read the rules. And so all the other kids kind of relied on me to interpret whatever rules I had read. And I remember thinking, oh boy, if I know the law, and I can actually win the game, so to speak, of life. And I still remember, working in a private law firm and working on the divorce case of a very, very famous novelist. You've read, I'm sure many of you read that person's book, so I won't mention the name. And every 2 minutes of my time was being billed to this client. I used to take folders with me down the hall to drink coffee, and it would take 5 minutes, and it would be billed to the client. And there were other places I used to take folders. I wouldn't bore you with the details. But I was thinking, is this what I'm really here to do, and is this why I actually learned the law? Again, to quote, obviously you can see already that Nelson Mandela is one of those leaders that I look up to all the time. And one of the things that he famously said is, what counts in life is not the mere facts that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead. And I think at some point, I stopped myself and said, hang on, this is not what I should be doing. I need to use the fact that I know what I know, and I've had the privilege of what I've had in life to actually make that difference. So that's number one. But of course, as you, on a day-to-day basis, this can get kind of blurred as you try to achieve targets that you think are completely justified. And you think, well, if I do that, maybe I compromise over there, I can achieve something bigger somewhere else. What worked for me is the fact that, being a journalist, I have a small group of friends, just a handful, who are also journalists, who are brutally honest with me. And, I can fool the world, but I can't fool them. So there are moments in time when I just sit down with them and we'll have a chat, and they will tell me exactly what I know is true, but I don't want to admit. And so having that kind of sounding board is important, I think, and being vulnerable yourself as a leader. I know it's difficult. I talked about failure reports, and maybe you don't have to do it on a pedestal or on a global stage, but having that sounding board and then reflecting on that's been really helpful. And lastly, I would add, more systemically, what I think we need to do is to put in place systems that are more transparent, that hold our systems and those who wield power accountable. Because, I worked in Singapore, where transparency and accountability are perhaps significantly higher than some other countries where I worked. And so the more things are transparent and more people's decisions are accountable to those who are actually impacted by those decisions, the more likely that leaders are going to make those kinds of decisions that are good for the vast majority of people on this planet.
I really appreciate what you all have shared there with that three-pronged question. I guess what I'm hearing from you all is that there's the red thread going through this conversation, that really leadership of today or in the decade to deliver is about bringing our humanity back into it. And how we're approaching things as humans, but then also how we're relating to each other as humans as being one of the most fundamental shifts in leadership mechanisms. Dr. Musimbi, you've previously spoken about this with respect to the importance of approaching issues with a common humanity, is the term that you've coined there, in mind, with the premise that we are all human together. Can you expand on the power of this kind of approach and how it can translate to today for business leaders, And secondly, to that question, what obstacles have you encountered toward implementing practical actions in that respect too?
Thank you. I used that term in a TED talk that I gave, and basically what I was drawing from was a practice that is very present in my in the place where I was born, within the community where I was born in Kenya, where people have always felt like the way to live with each other and provide change within the community is first to value the humanity that we bring once we are born. And we are different. At the back of my picture, you can probably see on the screen a group of people, and among them handicapped men and women and strong and children and people with large bodies and people with small bodies, etc. We come in a variety of ways as human beings. And we come sometimes born that way, sometimes vulnerabilities reformat us, either our brains, our bodies, etc. But we are still human. For as long as you have life in yourself, you're still human. And until or unless we see each other first as humans, we begin to already create barriers that hinder the possibility to share in leadership, to share in supporting one another with respect. So basically, I had used that from a frame where we sometimes use this frame when we are doing development work. You have a developed world and a developing world, companies that are big companies and small companies, entrepreneurial companies, or people that are working in under-resourced spaces and others that are working with over-resourced spaces, etc. And all of these distinctions look at things rather than the people that are within that system. So my drawing on this community upbringing that many of us grew up was that when you begin to see people first as human beings, the way that you treat them is different. I think it really even relates very much to what Sanaka said and what we probably all believe in our hearts, but we don't practice it because we are born within systems and we use those systems to determine how we provide leadership or even how we exchange help and aid, etc. Something that I think, in my view, this pandemic has shown us that something can happen that makes us all vulnerable. It doesn't matter what you have or who you are, you can become all vulnerable, even though, again, we see that that vulnerability is faced differently. So I have worked globally for probably 4 decades, been to every continent, probably visited close to 140 countries and lived in communities, etc. And actually, I find that essence of the humanity of people is present everywhere. It is present everywhere. It is colored by different people, but you sit with communities in their place. You visit families where you are fed in a place that is so far away from where you were born or where you are stationed, etc., and you discover the humanity of all of us. I believe that we can build on this. We can build on this on how we run organizations. I was a CEO for probably over in different places over 20 years, and I noticed that you can establish even at a place of work, a community of work, that humanity, and you apply it in policies. For example, in some places where I worked, we were able to try and understand what is it that the employees of that particular space need to survive and do their work best. So in one of the times that I provided the leadership, listening to the people, we were able to create long time ago, before everyone else did, internal policies that could assist parents do their parenting while providing the work. And it never impacted negatively to the company because we were able to apply it so people could go pick their kids in time if they needed to pick their kids in time. And we could be able to sometimes individualize even in a big company, but supported by a policy. And sometimes just finding out that what is it that makes certain workers of a place not give their best? Is it because they have been their own thinking of how to run a particular program or how to lead a particular program has not been taken into account because the company policies defined long time ago that this is how we do things? Now, to be able to implement this as a leader, I think that there are potentials, and there are potentials that make differences for different leaders if we bring our total self to that table. And I think that I was able to implement many different policies, even while based in a place like Geneva or San Francisco or New York, because I could bring the whole of me and say, I know that this worked for my community in thinking of people. The people that I work with are people. And so I'm going to do it with courage and with boldness, as something that is going to bring positive results to the company and positive results to the people. And therefore, we will be able to ride higher on it and produce more for the company. The other area that I talked about that I wanted to bring about is in the sharing of resources. We have sharing of resources. A number of you are probably familiar with the different ways in which aid is given to countries, either bilaterally, multilaterally, or through private companies or through philanthropy organizations, etc. And again, this is the area that I felt like sometimes defines how people treat each other, because money speaks very loudly. And when there's exchange of money, the power is diminished. People tend to think that if they be who they are, they might not be able to have access to those resources. And so, having also worked in the area of philanthropy for a long time, it was important to me that there were groups of people that worked in this area, especially in the funding movement, that challenged that and really helped say, if we see each other as people, because I think the people who receive the money help the people who have the money to spend that money, because you can't do anything with money unless you spend it. And if somebody gives you an opportunity to spend it into the right causes, you should value that person in the same way that you value the person's other people who have money or who have, and you should give them the ability to decide how to use that money. You don't give people money and say, I want you to go and do X only. You should listen and say, in what way would they be able to use that money in different way. And the last thing that I wanted to mention that was important to me that I continue to talk about, realizing our full humanity and bringing to the table, is this, when we begin from that space, then I think it's quite easy to shift into understanding the human rights of workers, the human rights of all the people, the issues that end up resulting into gender-based violence, because you don't practice violence on somebody that you value. So there has to be something that is wrong with how we consider each other, and in the end up in harming each other physically and mentally and spiritually, etc. So it's something that I'm continuing to write about. It's something that I'm continuing to practice, that our common humanity can help us to do more, to change policies of our countries and to influence how finance defines us, and knowledge defines us, and education defines us, and race defines us, etc. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Musimbi. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. We've had a few questions come through as well from our audience, both here in front of us and virtually. I was just going to put the first one to the floor that is the most asked question of the day by a country mile. This question is posed in first person. I'm keen to hear some practical examples of business partnerships which have translated into action on the SDGs, particularly on climate mitigation. Does anyone wish to take that one on board?
Yeah, look, I think from my experience with the organisation, we have a lot of skills in this space, and we've been working with a number of clients around how do they start to pivot their businesses, particularly in that resources sector. We hear a lot about those organisations making commitments to, to addressing issues like climate change more dramatically. And we work with a number of organisations taking some of our skill sets, be it our specialist skill sets around risk and climate and sustainability, or even just our general skills, because at the end of the day, some of this translates to fairly practical things like how do these organisations protect their assets from rising sea levels, et cetera, and so from an engineering perspective, some of that's just how do we, protect it, how do we apply basic engineering to those solutions and the like. So, I think for us, the practical application of a lot of what we do, not only within our organisation ourselves, we are just a people-based organisation. So for us, we've signed up to the Global Compact and, made certain commitments under it. And, some of it has been fast-tracked by COVID, the fact that we're not flying around all over the world to go to every meeting, and the fact that we can now sit in our living rooms and connect with people on the other side of the planet. I think we'll fast-track that for a whole load of organisations, but then also working with our clients, helping them understand the role that they can play, how they can pivot their businesses, and how they can do it both with that long-term aspiration of where they want to be in, say, 2025 or 2030 or 2050. But then I think the other important thing is to say, well, if that's where I want to be then, what are the steps I need to take today? So what are the granular steps that I can take either 6 months out or 12 months out, or what's the 3-year plan? And I think that can be a big challenge for organisations, is balancing that long-term aspiration with short-term, tangible, measurable actions that sort of all line up to that. So from Aurecon's perspective, it's a little bit of what we do as an organisation, but then the role we can play influencing the broader sector.
And we might move on to our next question. Perhaps this one feels like I might ask Musimbi actually to speak into this. Humanity and leadership is important, but we don't always see this trait in leaders when they see the opportunity to speak out on intractable issues like workplace violence, decarbonisation, or systemic racism. What needs to shift for leaders for leadership to be grounded in humanity and morals?
That's a difficult question, because it can only be answered subjectively, because we don't have measurable things that we can be able to track and say these leaders are doing the right thing. But I do think that continuing to share and there are leaders who actually are aware of these issues that the person has mentioned, and are doing something within their space of work. Having the space to actually share is important. And I want to link it with part of what the first question was dealing with. Are there examples? There are certain things that we can learn and expand the knowledge on when we work together, and we can be able to actually get the results of several people working on it. For example, the companies that have joined the Global Compact are beginning to give joint reports on certain issues that they have chosen to work on, and some of them relate to the climate change as well. So in the first round of results that companies have given, which was launched in 2020, over 300 companies registered in 19 countries. And their results actually have begun to show, and they are on the websites of the UN Global Compact, that can show some of the places where targets that they have set, either to achieve something like gender equality, or to work on issues of gender-based violence, or to work collectively on issues of climate change, etc. What is going to happen in the near future when we have collected some of the data, and especially data that show where we have success or where we have failure, we can be able to look both about the failures of the companies and the successes of the company, in order to drive deeper and say, what is it that made these things work well? What is this that made them not work well? And what can we do about it? So I think we are at that level. The other part of that question that I would think is that the world has a lot of knowledge, but the world does not often sit back and say, meaning leaders and other people, why can't we do the right thing? It's not that we don't know the right things. We do know the right thing. And we can even make a distinction between what is right and what is wrong. But I think that these questions of why can we not do the right thing should help us to keep we should ask them every day, and should help to keep us on our toes to do what is right. It's not something you ask once, but I think it's something that should keep people awake at night.
Couldn't agree more. And we have 2 minutes left of our session, so we may just revert back to our amazing panelists and in closing, ask them if they have 30 seconds of wisdom that they'd like to share with us here in the room and also virtually on anything that we've discussed today, and or in reflection about anything to do with their own leadership career, and perhaps some insight as to some things that they either are aspiring to achieve in the future and or would do differently had they had their time again. Who would like to go first? Sanaka, would you like to take the floor first?
So you remember my quote from Iran where I said, if you want to make God laugh, tell him or her your plans. So I guess I better stop making plans. To be perfectly honest, I had actually never even applied to work in the UN, and I ended up here 20 years ago. So this is how good my planning is. But if I had to do anything differently, would I do it differently? Of course, there are always things that you learn along the way. It would be pretty arrogant of me to say I did everything perfectly. But would I change my life fundamentally? I don't think so, because I think that what I have been so grateful for is, despite all my planning to be in one place, I had this opportunity to be exposed to so many different people with so many different backgrounds, coming from different countries with different abilities, who all taught me something. And the thing I go back to is when I was about 5 or 6 years old, my parents used to take me to visit a family who had an autistic child. And this child scared the living daylights out of me. And I remember that this child's father was a photographer. So whenever we went to that house, that association for me was of somebody putting a camera in my face. And there was not a single picture of me during my childhood where I wasn't crying, because every time somebody put a camera in my face, I thought of this child, and I thought this child was going to come and scare the living daylights out of me. Over time, my parents kept taking me there. I learned that this child is a child and was just wanting to be my friend. And, I learned to smile. She taught me how to smile. So I guess that's the one lesson that I take away from my life so far, and maybe share with you too, is that everybody has something to share with you, and everybody has something to teach you. We just have to be open to it. Thanks.
Thank you. And we are right on time now to finish. So I will ask both Musimbi and Louise if you could condense it down to 15 seconds each. That would be amazing.
I think, just to go back to purpose, and I usually say this to young people, but I think COVID has shown us that life's too short, so I think it goes for anyone. I think it's important to figure out what you stand for, what you were put on this planet to achieve, find an organisation that you can align with. Many of these issues like gender equality and that have been around for 100 years, and we've got 10 years to deliver on these goals. So it's kind of a case of go hard or go home. So I think be driven by something.
Nice, thank you.
Change is inevitable. I borrow from Bishop Tutu. Be prisoners of hope that change will come. Look at life positively and count what works, and say, and do not count only what doesn't work. And lastly, I want to say, if you're a leader, you'll be a leader until you die. So light other people's candles, but do not diminish your own candle.
Amazing. Well, absolute words of wisdom, and we're so grateful to have you guys here today to share them with us. Thank you so much, Louise, Sanaka, Musimbi. If we could please give everyone a hand. And I'm going to pass over to Rob now.
Thank you. A big thank you to Kathryn and all of our speakers, Kathryn Sforcina, Sanaka Samarasinha, Dr. Musimbi Kanyoro, and Louise Adams. That was a great way to start. We are going to see more audience interaction as we go over the next day and a half, but it was great to see the questions starting to come through on Chime, and we'll be seeing how we basically connect what we've learned over the last hour and a bit over the sessions to come. Just very briefly, some of the threads that were coming out of that session from the different speakers, highlighting the value and the power of collective action, I found particularly important. Embracing the humanity in leadership, that came through again and again. I know I spent a lot of last year scared. I spent a lot of 2020 scared, but it wasn't until I started talking to people about that those common threads of humanity started to come out, and people started to talk about that and using that in leadership. Creating a space in the conversation to bring in new and better ideas. Sanaka mentioned that right up front, and I think that's really important. Leave space for the new. Don't assume that we know everything now. Aligning your organizational culture with your purpose, that was great to hear. And then lastly, and this was really important to hear from Dr. Kanyoro, remember to look at people as human beings, not just pieces of a system. And I think we need to come back to that. Whether we're talking about modern slavery or poverty or clean water, remember to look at people as human beings.